On the morning of December 24th, 2002, 27-year-old Laci Peterson was preparing for Christmas. 8 months pregnant with her first child, she was looking forward to welcoming her son, Conner, into the world. Living in Modesto, California, with her husband, Scott Peterson, Laci appeared to have the life she had always wanted. But by the end of Christmas Eve, she would vanish without a trace. According to Scott, he left their home that morning to go fishing at Berkeley Marina. He claimed Laci stayed behind and planned to walk their dog before spending the day preparing for the holidays. Hours later, Scott returned home and reported that his wife was missing. Concern spread rapidly among family and friends. Search teams formed almost immediately. Volunteers distributed flyers, searched neighborhoods, and combed through nearby areas looking for any sign of Laci. The case quickly attracted media attention. As the days passed with no answers, investigators began examining every possible lead. At first, police treated the case as a missing person investigation. But as detectives looked closer at Scott Peterson's statements and behavior, questions began to emerge. Why did parts of his story seem inconsistent? Why did he appear unusually calm while his pregnant wife was missing? What initially seemed like a heartbreaking disappearance was slowly turning into something much darker, unknown to the public. Investigators were already uncovering secrets that would soon transform the case into one of the most notorious murder investigations in American history. As investigators dug deeper into Scott Peterson's life, they discovered information that dramatically changed the direction of the case. Behind the image of a concerned husband was a secret relationship that Scott had carefully hidden from almost everyone around him. Detectives learned that Scott was involved with a massage therapist named Amber Frey. Even more shocking was the fact that Amber had no idea Scott was married. He had introduced himself as a single man and built an entirely false identity around their relationship. When Amber learned that Scott's pregnant wife was missing, she immediately contacted authorities. Her cooperation would become a crucial part of the investigation. Through recorded phone conversations, detectives gained insight into Scott's behavior during the search for Laci. In one of the most disturbing revelations, investigators learned that Scott had allegedly told Amber weeks before Laci disappeared that this would be his first Christmas without his wife. The statement raised serious questions once Laci vanished shortly afterward. The recorded calls revealed a pattern of deception. While the nation watched the search for Laci unfold on television, Scott continued lying to Amber about his whereabouts. During one conversation, he claimed to be celebrating New Year's Eve in Paris. In reality, he was attending a public vigil for his missing wife. The recordings painted a picture of a man living two separate lives. Public suspicion intensified. News outlets focused heavily on the affair and Scott's apparent lack of concern. While detectives still lacked direct evidence linking him to a crime, many began to wonder whether Scott Peterson knew far more about Laci's disappearance than he was willing to admit. For nearly 4 months, investigators searched for answers. Despite countless tips and extensive searches, no one knew what had happened to Laci Peterson. Then, in April 2003, a discovery along the shoreline of San Francisco Bay changed everything. A passerby found the remains of an infant near the water's edge. Authorities immediately secured the area and launched an investigation. The following day, additional human remains were discovered nearby. DNA testing later confirmed the heartbreaking truth. The remains belonged to Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Conner. The discovery devastated Laci's family and ended any hope that she might still be alive. Investigators immediately focused on one critical detail. The remains were found near the same body of water where Scott Peterson claimed he had gone fishing on the day Laci disappeared. Prosecutors would later argue that this connection was far too significant to ignore. Due to the condition of the remains, medical examiners were unable to determine exactly how Laci died. Nevertheless, investigators believed the circumstances strongly supported a homicide investigation. As public attention intensified, Scott Peterson remained under close surveillance. Detectives monitored his activities while building their case. Then, on April 18, 2003, Scott was arrested. Authorities stated that he was carrying cash, multiple cell phones, camping equipment, and altered identification-related items when taken into custody. Prosecutors believed he was preparing to flee. Scott denied all accusations and maintained his innocence. However, with the discovery of Laci and Conner's remains, investigators believe they finally had the evidence needed to charge him with murder and bring the case to trial. The trial of Scott Peterson officially began in 2004 and immediately became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in the country. Media organizations packed the courtroom, and millions of Americans followed every development. Prosecutors faced a difficult challenge. They had no confession, no eyewitnesses, and no direct forensic evidence linking Scott to murders. Instead, they relied on a powerful circumstantial case built from dozens of pieces of evidence. The prosecution argued that Scott's motive centered on his desire to escape marriage and impending fatherhood. They pointed his affair with Amber Frey, his repeated lies, and his behavior after Laci disappeared as evidence supporting their theory. Jurors listened to recordings of Scott's conversations with Amber. They heard testimony about his secret double life and examined the timeline of events surrounding Christmas Eve 2002. Prosecutors emphasized that Laci and Conner's remains were discovered near the area where Scott admitted he had been fishing. The defense challenged the state's case at every opportunity. Scott's attorneys argued that there was no direct proof he committed murder. They questioned investigative methods, disputed conclusions drawn by prosecutors, and suggested alternative possibilities. For months, witnesses, experts, and investigators testified. The courtroom became the center of a national debate. Supporters of the prosecution believed the evidence clearly demonstrated Scott's guilt. Others argued that the case relied too heavily on assumptions and circumstantial evidence. As the trial neared its conclusion, the responsibility for determining Scott's fate rested entirely with the jury. Their decision would not only affect Scott Peterson's future, but also bring a measure of closure to one of the most heartbreaking cases in recent memory. After months of testimony and extensive deliberations, the jury finally reached its decision in November 2004. The nation waited anxiously as the verdict was read inside a packed courtroom. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder in the death of their unborn son, Conner. The verdict marked a major turning point in a case that had captured headlines for nearly 2 years. For Laci's family, the decision represented justice after months of grief and uncertainty. Prosecutors argued that the verdict reflected the strength of the evidence presented during trial. They believed Scott's lies, secret affair, suspicious actions, and the location where the bodies were discovered all pointed to one conclusion. However, not everyone agreed. Scott's supporters maintained that the evidence was entirely circumstantial and argued that reasonable doubt still existed. Debate surrounding the case continued long after the verdict was delivered. In 2005, Scott was sentenced to death. The sentence generated widespread discussion and prompted years of legal appeals. His attorneys challenged numerous aspects of the trial, claiming procedural errors had affected the outcome. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned Scott's death sentence due to issues involving jury selection during the penalty phase. However, the court upheld his murder convictions. Scott was later resentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Despite continued legal challenges and public debate, the convictions remain in place today. For many, the verdict closed a painful chapter. For others, questions surrounding the case continue to fuel discussion more than 2 decades later. More than 20 years after Laci Peterson disappeared, the case remains one of the most discussed true crime stories in American history. It continues to generate documentaries, books, podcasts, and debates among legal experts and investigators. Part of the reason is the tragic nature of the crime itself. Laci was a young woman preparing for motherhood. Her disappearance during the holiday season captured public attention and sparked an emotional response across the country. The case also became a powerful example of how media coverage can shape public perception. As news outlets provided constant updates, millions of viewers formed opinions about Scott Peterson long before the trial concluded. Some believe the evidence overwhelmingly proved his guilt. Others continue to question whether the investigation explored every possible lead. The case has become a frequent topic in discussions about circumstantial evidence and the role it plays in criminal convictions. Even today, legal analysts examine how prosecutors built their case despite lacking direct evidence. Yet beyond the courtroom arguments and media attention lies the human tragedy at the center of the story. Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Conner, lost their lives, leaving behind grieving family members whose lives were forever changed. Their memory remains the most important part of this story. The disappearance of Laci Peterson began as a missing person case and evolved into one of the most infamous murder investigations in modern America. Whether viewed as a clear case of guilt or a subject of continuing debate, its impact remains undeniable. Decades later, the case still serves as a reminder of how quickly an ordinary day can turn into a tragedy that captures the attention of an entire nation.